Welcome to Journalist Roundtable. I'm Phil Beckerman. Today we are joined by Taylor Millard, a reporter with the Delaware Valley Journal, Rachel McDevitt, Energy and Environment reporter for StateImpact Pennsylvania, WITF, and Kate Huangpu, government reporter at Spotlight PA. Kate, how important were energy issues in this year's election?
Yeah, I think that costs and inflation were probably the biggest issues, but a part of that is ensuring that energy prices are low. And that's definitely been top of mind in the legislature. You know, the state Senate in particular, Republicans control that chamber, and that's been a big priority, especially in response to more environmentally friendly policies, things that like RGGI or the governor's alternative to that, Pacer and Press, that would put more restrictions on energy producers. That's sort of the perpetual debate between the two chambers and the two parties, regulation of energy companies and how that might affect energy costs.
Rachel, as you've been covering the energy and the environment during the election process, what did you see? What were you seeing voters' interest showing?
Right, yeah, I think Kate is right about the cost. I feel like we were hearing a lot about costs, and then nobody's really talking about climate or the environment when they're talking about those big issues that are really important to them. I feel like I was often like, well, what about my beat? What about what I cover? But I didn't hear a ton about it. I mean, obviously, Republicans talked about sort of unleashing energy, increasing fracking and natural gas production and things like that to be energy independent, which the United States already is. We produce so much energy here, and drilling and oil production actually went up under the Biden administration. So there is sort of a disconnect between what's really happening in the energy space and what people perceive could happen or is happening to them. But I think Kate is absolutely right that people are more concerned about costs and then other sort of social issues as opposed to the environment or energy being like one of their top voting issues.
Taylor, as you were looking at this year's election and thinking about energy, how important was the energy industry during these campaigns?
I think it was very important. They were big in getting their message out, in making comments about what was going on and some of the regulations that they were running into. One thing that they said was, sure, energy and oil and gas drilling is up during the Biden-Harris administration. However, if you look at the offshore land leases, if you look at the leases involving the Arctic, they really weren't. You didn't have a ton of people. You didn't have a ton of leases come through. I know the Arctic National Refuge, Wildlife Refuge leases were canceled by the Biden-Harris administration pretty much on one. And in fact, when they for the Inflation Reduction Act, one of the things that Interior Secretary Deb Haaland said was that this is going to help us transition from fossil fuels to more renewable energy.
Rachel, as you're covering both energy and the environment, now that the incoming Trump administration is preparing for its policies, what are you seeing as far as, say, concerns from environmentalists transitioning from a Biden to a Trump administration?
Right, I think the big concerns are trying to do away with regulations that would put restrictions on oil and gas or fossil fuel production, or even give incentive to renewables. The incoming Trump administration has not been super friendly to renewables. They don't want to see those types of incentives that we've seen through the Inflation Reduction Act, which is a huge climate spending bill under the Biden administration. That gave companies and individuals a lot of tax credit availability and other rebates to make energy efficiency upgrades, to use less energy, and also to adopt renewables like home solar panels or electric vehicles. Those are saving money is popular no matter what party you belong to, and so there may be an issue with trying to, or a divide, I'd say. There's a divide between what you say on the campaign trail of wanting to support one thing, wanting to claw back, say, spending in one area, but then when you get into office, there may be Republican lawmakers who don't want to see those credits go away because it is benefiting their constituents. Anybody can put solar panels in their house, doesn't have to be a Republican or a Democrat. But I think the concerns are any possible clawing back of that climate money, which is helping reduce emissions nationally, and then loosening restrictions on oil and gas. Like there's a provision of the Inflation Reduction Act that also is going to charge oil and gas producers for methane they release. Methane's a very potent greenhouse gas that contributes to warming. There may be some effort to try to roll that back and let oil and gas as an industry sort of set their own rules. But business is complicated and the world is moving in a certain direction with energy transition. I think we've already heard that the CEO of Exxon is saying, like, no, we don't want you to get rid of all of the sort of climate provisions that we've seen over the last couple of years, because our business is already adapting to those things. So it's going to be complicated.
Taylor, what are your expectations?
That was actually something. Sorry to interrupt. That was something that the American Petroleum Institute made a big deal about in talking about their desire to support an all of the above kind of solution when it comes to climate change and energy reform, and not necessarily throwing a bunch of money towards EVs and towards greenhouse gas through environmental issues. I certainly know that they are preparing a public push against this methane, the new NEPA regulations. That's coming. It's already started, but I would expect more to kind of kick up after the start of the year.
Kate, I want to talk about one of your stories that you wrote. You write that companies have yet to claim a single dollar from a $2.6 billion tax credit package that Pennsylvania enacted in 2022 to encourage natural gas use, hydrogen production, milk production, and more. Why are people not using this tax credit?
That's a great question. I mean, some of it I will say is also that like there is no hydrogen being produced in Pennsylvania yet. That sort of was part of the incentive for the Department of Energy to select Pennsylvania as one of the applicants that would receive billions from the federal government for a hydrogen hub. That's also a part of the Inflation Reduction Act and the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. But a lot of it, I think the changes that are being proposed to that are to lessen lower standards for like the number of jobs that need to be produced, or it's just making it easier for companies to get that tax credit in the first place. But a lot of it right now is just that, you know, the industries that would be taking advantage of that tax credit haven't had projects come into Pennsylvania and haven't had the opportunity to then like recoup that money.
Now, Governor Shapiro has offered an alternative update to that plan. What was his plan, and what were the chances of it passing through the General Assembly?
Yeah, so he again made those suggestions to make it easier for companies to claim the tax credit. He added just an energy production tax credit as well, with a caveat that some of it has to be produced in a clean way. The chances of it passing are relatively slim, especially between now and the next session. I believe session ends on November 30th. Someone can check if I'm right about that, but there's not many. I don't think there's any days left really, and it hasn't made its way through the Senate, any of the amendments. So it will probably be something that if they do try to change it, it'll be next session.
Now, Rachel, another piece of legislation that you wrote about, Senate Bill 211, that would require solar companies to prove they have enough money to cover 10% of the cleanup costs. That's also in the General Assembly. We are at the end of a session at this point. Yeah. Tell us about that bill and what its future is.
It's an interesting bill because it's come up a couple sessions in a row now, I think. So it would, it's been an issue among some, mainly Republican lawmakers. They want to make sure that renewable energy projects have cash on hand to clean up these projects at the end of their useful life. So that would be in 25 or 30 years. There's been a push and pull on that. Renewable energy developers have said it would make projects way more expensive to build because you would have to have this financial assurance to tear down in 30 years right up front. So this bill is a compromise really between industry and more environmentally friendly lawmakers and those who would rather see this type of a law. So this was a real compromise effort. It went through the Senate and also the House Environmental Resources and Energy Committee. And now it looks like it's stuck in an appropriations committee here at the end of the session, so it's probably not going to go anywhere. I would imagine we're going to see it reintroduced since it did have this bipartisan support towards the end of this session.
Taylor, in anticipation of the incoming Trump administration, the American Petroleum Institute released its energy plan. What does that plan say?
Well, to talk about stuff that is running out, legislation that's running out that Congress and energy groups hope to see passed before the end of the year, there's going to be this really big push that API said they were basically making the bipartisan energy permitting bill that passed a Senate committee in July. So it's been sitting there since July, and we're now in November and almost out of time. That's how slow stuff moves on Capitol Hill. That's something that they really want to get done before the lame duck session ends. That's a big thing that's been on their role, and so I would expect some movement on that, depending on kind of where everything else goes. And they've also talked about API talked about leveraging America's natural resources. Obviously, we've already talked about opening up offshore energy development as well as the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. That's something that you're going to see API really push going into the new administration. They want to do protection of consumer choice. When you look at EVs, some of the mandates, some of the statewide mandates that are out there, like the stuff in California on tailpipe emissions, that's something that they're really going to push the EPA and the Department of Energy to say, no, we're not going to grant the California waiver. And that California waiver is saying that EVs have to make up 2/3 of all vehicles sold in the US by 2032. And what they're sitting there and saying is this makes no sense when you have a lot of people who really like their petroleum, their gas-fueled cars, or they like their hybrid cars. So I would expect that to be a focus as well. And then also expanding liquid natural gas exports. America is the world's largest LNG exporter. This is despite this pause on new LNG exports that the White House announced in January. What API says is, where the country is the largest natural gas exporter, but those could be higher. And ExxonMobil have both said that traditional fuels, it's just going to keep getting higher and higher going into the next couple of decades. And this is despite the environmental mandates.
Taylor, how much support in the Trump administration is there for this type of plan?
I would say that when it comes to this type of plan, that it is something that the Trump administration is a fan of. When you look at the new Energy Secretary nominee, Chris Wright, he has said that he supports an all of the above energy platform. So I would expect him to kind of take stuff from the API energy roadmap. As somebody who is a natural gas CEO and energy CEO, I'd expect him to sit there and say, yeah, we like this. We want to see this happen because this can grow the economy, create jobs, and support allies.
Kate, I want to go back to the state budget that was passed in July. And what were some of the key energy measures that were in that budget?
Yeah, it kind of passed alongside the budget rather than in the budget itself. There was some funding for programs like Solar for Schools, which was a bill that passed alongside the budget that provided grants to schools who wanted to build out solar infrastructure, like solar panels, storage, things like that. There was a bill that passed late at night. I remember it was like 10 p.m. that created this carbon capture and injection well infrastructure that passed the state Senate quite late, and then the House. But a lot of the bills were sort of common grounds. I mean, it makes sense. The state Senate's controlled by Republicans, the state House is controlled by Democrats. So there was some, hesitation with carbon capture on the parts of Democrats. There was some hesitation with solar panels on the parts of Republicans. But they sort of have common ground right now, because in part of like the Inflation Reduction Act and an Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, there's a lot of money in energy, period. So folks were trying to find common ground and things that they could compromise on in order to get some of that funding.
Rachel, we talk about carbon capture. What does that mean?
Carbon capture can mean a couple different things. It can mean capturing it directly at the point of your emissions release. So for an industrial process, you usually have to burn some kind of a fuel to make your product, or you burn it for energy, as we do in power plants. And so that would mean putting device, equipment, technology onto your smokestacks to prevent that carbon dioxide from reaching the atmosphere. And so you would trap it, and then you would either bury it underground, or most of the carbon capture that happens in the United States right now, the carbon is recycled and used to drill more wells for oil and gas. It's called enhanced oil recovery because it just helps drive those wells deeper, push more oil up to the surface. There's also direct air capture. So there are some companies that are working on machines that basically just suck air in and they sort of filter out the carbon dioxide and then capture that. I think there's one sort of novel plant in like Iceland who they capture the carbon and then they're able to turn it into rock and bury it underground. So it's a way to prevent that warming gas from reaching the atmosphere.
Now, was this a priority for the Biden administration? Was there federal funding coming in for this?
There was a lot of federal funding, and it's part of, I think, the hydrogen hub in Western Pennsylvania, which is going to be more reliant on what they call blue hydrogen, which is taking methane from natural gas, and they do sort of a chemical reaction. They strip out the hydrogen and then carbon from the methane. And so to make that a clean hydrogen itself, when it's burned, does not produce any warming emissions. Carbon dioxide is a warming gas. And so to make this a climate-friendly fuel using natural gas, you would have to capture that carbon dioxide. So yeah, the Biden administration was in on supporting carbon capture, supporting projects like that hydrogen hub in Western Pennsylvania, and not just avoiding carbon emissions, but allowing them in some way and then capturing them to reduce their impact.
Now, Rachel, you also
wonder.
Oh, go ahead, Taylor.
I really wonder how much of this push to do the carbon capture stuff is the U.S. just looking to basically overcompensate for the emissions that are coming out of China and India, because those are the countries that kind of lead the world in carbon emissions. So I wonder if the West is looking to reduce stuff as much as possible to kind of offset that.
I think the United States is trying to be a leader in this space because and from the Biden administration's perspective, it's better to lead than follow, right? But the United States is the largest historical emitter of greenhouse gases in the world because of how much we've industrialized and how much faster we did it than countries like China and India. So China and India are larger emitters right now, but over time, the United States has been the most responsible for it. And I also think the push towards carbon capture is about maintaining some sort of status quo. So not changing fuels, but changing the way that our fuels interact with the atmosphere.
Now, Rachel.
Yeah, and I would add that also there's been a lot of focus on developing new technology, like the investment in clean energy from the IIJA, IRA, coming from the federal level, is equally, or maybe not equally, but a significant amount of the rhetoric that I've seen at least is about developing new technology and staying on the cutting edge to some extent of how to produce energy in the 21st century.
Now, one of the interesting issues that's going on right now is this discussion about restarting the 3 Mile Island nuclear plant. And Rachel, what's driving that?
The 3 Mile Island nuclear plant, there's interest in restarting it because it would be a very large source of clean energy. And by clean, I mean would not emit greenhouse gases that warm the planet. And so there are commitments from large companies like Microsoft, which wants to actually become carbon negative, meaning they clean up the atmosphere more than they produce emissions into the atmosphere. And so Microsoft is interested in securing a large source of emissions-free power. They went into a power purchase agreement with the owner of 3 Mile Island, Constellation. And so under that agreement, Constellation would restart the plant, and then all of the energy that is created and sent out to the grid, Microsoft would buy it from the grid to power their data centers.
What is involved in the process of restarting the plant?
So Constellation makes it sound like it's going to be really routine, right? Nuclear plants and all types of power plants go through these routine outages where they close, they do maintenance, and then they restart again. 3 Mile Island, Unit 1, let's be clear, not Unit 2, which will never restart, but Unit 1 closed in 2019 just because it wasn't economical. It wasn't making money for the company, and so they closed it. And it's basically been mothballed. They did some things to start closing it down, but it is not very advanced in the tear down and the eventual decommission of the plant. And so there's going to be some equipment replaced. They need to replace the transformers to connect to the grid and send the energy out. And then there's going to be what Constellation says is basically routine maintenance. So their turbines, which turn to create the power, are still in good working order. Their generator, they say, is in good working order. So they're going to have to basically like flush out pipes, make sure all their electrical connections are good, and then refuel and bring more nuclear fuel onto site to create that reaction.
How has the state government responded to this plan?
The state government, I think, is supportive, but I haven't heard any real official support from like monetary support from the Shapiro administration. The Shapiro administration is supportive of the jobs that it's going to bring. They're going to employ upwards of 600 people at this plant when it's up and running. And it's good for the energy economy of Pennsylvania, of which we have a huge amount of energy in the state. So the Shapiro administration, I know, had met with Constellation officials. I think they're supportive of the plan, but I haven't heard of like any specific tax break or credit or anything like that for this work.
Taylor, you wrote about an electricity auction. One of the largest electricity transmission operators spent a lot more money on their auction than they had in the past. Tell us about that, and what does that mean for consumers?
Yeah, there's a lot of worry that that the U.S. is running out of its power capacity, which is again weird because the U.S. is the largest producer of natural gas, along with wind, and is second in solar electricity. But one thing that PJM Interconnection said is that they paid 700% more than they had previously over the previous year for their most recent power auction. And so what is worried about spending that $14.7 billion is that they're going to have to make up that money somehow. And by making up that money, it includes sitting there, and utilities are going to have to raise rates or will raise rates in some capacity to be able to make up that money. Now, the good news is we're not talking about all of a sudden seeing brownouts. This isn't California in the early 2000s where there were rolling blackouts. This isn't Texas in 2000 during the winter storms in 2021, where swaths of the country the state was without power. Sorry, my Texan is showing. It's a joke that Texas can be its own country down there. But it's going to be something that there's going to be concern about, that a lot of people are concerned about, especially with coal and natural gas power plants being removed from the grid due to some of the rules that were released by the Biden-Harris administration.
I don't think any natural gas plants in Pennsylvania are being removed from the grid for environmental reasons. Natural gas is still much cleaner burning than coal, and coal is just not economic in Pennsylvania. There are more expensive environmental regulations that those coal plants need to comply with, but it's also just expensive, and it can't compete with natural gas. Natural gas has done way more to kill coal in Pennsylvania than environmental regulations. But the concern, from my understanding from PJM, the power grid operator, is that they are worried about those retirements of coal plants outpacing the growth of renewables and adding that new power onto the grid. So there's a concern about the balance and the timing, but from what I have heard in legislative hearings when they bring PJM in to testify, there is no immediate danger of power shortages or brownouts or blackouts in Pennsylvania.
Yeah, there's enough energy through spring of 2026. So, like I said, nobody's got to worry about not being able to turn on the lights this year or next year or even the beginning of 2026. It just could be afterward that they're discussing their worries about that.
Our guests have been Taylor Millard, a reporter with the Delaware Valley Journal, Rachel McDevitt, energy and environment reporter with StateImpact Pennsylvania, and Kate Huangpu from Spotlight, PA. Thank you all for joining us. I'm Phil Beckman, and thank you for watching.